Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Art for All group. This group is celebrating International Women's Day, which was yesterday, and so I just wanted to go through, I suppose, some of the history of female artists and maybe some surprising things that you might not know about women in the art world. So, just going to share my screen. And I thought I'd start off with this image of the front cover of Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own. This front cover was designed by her sister, Vanessa Bell, who was an artist. And it comes from an essay that Virginia Woolf read out in Cambridge. And it was thinking about why there aren't more women artists in history, women writers, women painters, women playwrights. And Virginia Woolf came to the conclusion that in order for a woman to make art, she must have money. One must have money and a room of one's own in order to create. And I suppose this also leads us to why there haven't historically been people from poorer backgrounds becoming artists, because if you need money and a room of your own in order to have the leisure and space, the space and the support to make artwork, then how can you hope to achieve notoriety, success, fame without these things underpinning this? And I suppose we think about the fact that up until about 100 years ago, most women in the UK didn't have the vote. Once it got to after the First World War, women who were over the age of 30 who owned property, they got the vote. That still left out a big swathe of the population. You think back before that, women changed their names to their husbands' surnames. Before women started having surnames, they didn't have any surnames. They were just property of whoever was nearby. And this idea of having a room of one's own, but also, I suppose, representation in the rooms where art is displayed, and that's what I want to come on to next. This is some work by the Guerrilla Girls, so active in the 1980s, 1990s, and they put up these adverts and they pose the question, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum in New York, Metropolitan Museum of Art? And at the time, less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So women have been perceived by art, by artists, they have been gazed upon, but historically they haven't done much of the gazing. And the Guerrilla Girls also made this advert, the advantages of being a woman artist, working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labelled feminine, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, having more time to work when your mate dumps you for someone younger, being included in revised versions of art history, not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, getting your picture in art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. So, whilst some things have changed in the art world, if we look at the Turner Prize, a large proportion of the people who've won the Turner Prize over the past 10 years have been women. But there is still this gap that happens, and there are far more female art students than there are male art students. Something like in 2018 in the UK, 62% of art students were female. But if you look at the representation in smaller galleries and in larger institutions in the capital and outside the capital, things still skew towards men. We have to ask ourselves why that is. But I thought I'd look at some female artists throughout history that some of their work might be a bit surprising. So this, first of all, is from 1548. This is a painting by a self-portrait by Catherine van Hemessen, and it's widely thought to be the first self-portrait of an artist ever depicted seated at an easel. So this is the first time we see an artist at an easel, and it's painted by a woman. She was a portrait painter. One of the reasons she could be a painter was because her father was a painter. So back in 1548, normally boys would have been apprenticed out to craftsmen, to artists, and they would have gone to live with them, but girls couldn't go and live in a strange man's house because that wasn't really what the idea wasn't really in line with the morals of the time. But she was able to be trained by her father. She stopped painting when she got married, but in this picture here, she is 20 and she has an easel and she's painting herself. This picture is by an artist called Artemisia Gentileschi, and this is a very gory picture. This is called Judith and Holofernes, and it's a biblical scene. It's probably Artemisia Gentileschi's most famous work. She also was trained by her father, but then she went to be trained in the household of another painter, whose surname was Tassi, and he ended up raping her. And there was a trial, a very public trial. She was physically examined in public. She had to go through huge amounts of, I suppose, invasion, distress, trauma. So it's maybe no wonder that she ended up perhaps painting something like this, although this would have been a commission. Maybe some of her feeling is going into that. But she also painted many other pictures, biblical scenes, portraits. She was a prolific artist, and she set up her own studio. She carried on painting. This work is by a woman called Harriet Powers, and she is an American folk artist and quilt maker, and she was born into slavery in rural Georgia. And she used traditional applique techniques to record local legends, Bible stories, and astronomical events on her quilts. Only 2 of her quilts are known to have survived. Bible quilt on the left in 1886, and pictorial quilt from 1898. And her quilts are considered among the finest examples of 19th century Southern quilting. So she tells stories on her quilts, and she was particularly interested in celestial events, so stars, comets, and these had great significance for her. And these quilts are very valuable to her. She was a mother of about 9 children. She had to support her family after her husband lost a deal of their money and then left the family. But she created these works along the way, and they're works not just to make money, because she was offered money from somebody to buy one of these quilts. She initially turned it down. So these quilts are very much her creative expression about what she felt about the world around her and about biblical stories. And speaking of a room of one's own, so Harriet Powers managed to find this kind of psychological room of her own in a space where she might not have, she clearly didn't have very much money, had few resources, but she still carved a space for herself. And speaking of spaces for ourselves, I suppose my next point is thinking about Tracey Emin's Bed, probably one of the more famous works by a female artist recently. And of this, Tracey Emin said a number of years after it was installed, I think because it caused such a stir at the time and people remember it, and because I've never seen anything like it before in my life in an art gallery ever. So I think it is still seminal. It still has a presence because almost everyone has been there to a certain degree and can relate to it. People respond to it in a very human way and take it far more seriously now than they did 20 years ago. I don't think people hate it anymore. I think they hated it because they hated contemporary art and they hated new ideas, or they hated to be exposed. Basically, I'm just exposing their own lives in an even more extreme way. Everybody has had a stain in their life to some degree. I'm just saying it's okay, it's all right. So, Tracey Emin's Bed, this her very personal space, being transplanted into a gallery in kind of, I think of the Oliver Cromwell portrait, the idea of warts and all, this is kind of stains and all, this is what her life felt like at the time, just in a couple of meters squared. And it flies in the face of kind of what I think we should, how we feel we should behave, that we shouldn't show our mess, that we shouldn't show that people have sex or that they get drunk or that they're messy or that they're broken. But actually, this transplanting this mess into this sterile space suddenly creates a huge contrast between the human and the art world that's meant to be pristine and nicely packaged. And this isn't nicely packaged, this is raw and, yeah, messy. But whether it's the case that we can find beauty in the mess and the morass, and that this was her life, this was a woman's life when she was 35. And can we look at that? Can we look at the truth of that? Does it have to be painted with flowers for us to find it palatable? Do we have to find art palatable? Is that the point of art? Just to make pretty pictures? And this, I suppose, is when we think about making things palatable. This is Frida Kahlo's medical corset. She had an accident in her late teens, early 20s. She was on an old tram, and there was a very, very serious accident, and she had her spine shattered by a pole from the tram and had many other internal injuries. And she had to wear a leg brace, she had to wear this corset, she was bedbound for a lot of her life. And here we can see this column in the middle, which possibly represents her spinal column. And it's broken and cracked. There are these cracks, there are things growing. And she would have painted this lying in bed on herself. And we have this kind of sort of mold of her body, and that it isn't perfect, that it's broken and that it's messy. And is she trying to make this palatable for us, to decorate it for us? And I think maybe not. I think it was for herself. Her clothing hid a lot about her. She had bright, colourful clothing that would have covered this corset, but this is also another way of making something for her, but also to make her brokenness somehow more than just that, to make it into art. And this is a piece of artwork by Kara Walker. So she is an artist, a writer, a professor, and it's done in 1998. And I think given the events of the last year, Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, all the protests we've seen, this is an important piece of work to look back on. It was made in 1998, and it's called African American. And Kara Walker uses silhouettes, these 19th century pieces of artwork, style of artwork, to look at the world as it is today. And this person, are they flying? Are they falling? Are they alive? And what does it mean to be African and American and to be looked at? And here we can see this person's body, and there's a lot going on here, and we're not quite sure which way is up. Maybe the person themselves is not quite sure either. But there's movement, something going to happen. And this is Yayoi Kusama, a famous Japanese artist. She's worked for many, many years. She has always made art, even when she has had difficulties with her own mental health, where she's been in hospital, and has, I suppose, found a room of her own, separate from her family, who maybe wanted to silence her, and found this space, and has created many, many rooms that are full of her ideas of art and beauty and relevance. And this work is by an Indian-Hungarian artist called Amrita Shergill, and she painted in the early 20th century. And this is a bride at her toilet. And Amrita Shergill decided, she trained in Paris, but she decided that actually her calling was to paint her home country, the country she considered home, India, and to shine a light on the cultures that she found there, that she was part of there, and to create a new language and to show in the art world these moments that hadn't been shown before, these rooms that women were inhabiting that wouldn't really have been considered, or might not have been considered worthy, or would have been considered through the male gaze, but take on a very different feel and meaning when looked at through Amrita Shergill's eyes. And that's the end of the video for today. So I hope that this has been interesting for you, that it might inspire you to go and look up other female artists, people that you don't expect, and maybe that if, whatever gender you are, that it might also inspire you to find a space for yourself, whether you have a room of your own or whether you can create a space within yourself to do some creative work. That's, yeah, I think a worthy thing, a worthy way to celebrate International Women's Day. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. All the best.